Between 1984 and 1986, Hollywood burned through $250 million and watched almost none of it come back. This wasn't a rough patch. It was a sustained financial catastrophe spread across some of the biggest names in the industry. Supergirl cost $35 million and pulled in $14 million. Howard the Duck cost Universal $36 million and generated so little return that a Variety headline directly attributed a studio executive's departure to a cartoon duck. Revolution earned $359,000 on a $28 million budget, which works out to roughly 1 cent returned for every dollar spent. These weren't just bad movies, they were structural disasters that reshaped studios, ended careers, and in at least 2 cases came close to destroying entire production companies. Here are 10 of the worst box office disasters Hollywood produced in that stretch. Supergirl was supposed to keep the Salkind family operation running. Alexander and Ilya Salkind, the producers behind the original Superman films, put $35 million into this 1984 spin-off, expecting the brand to carry them, and you'd think riding the Superman name would at least get you halfway there. The domestic box office returned $14 million, nominal 1984 figures, against that $35 million spend, which left the Salkinds staring at a loss that couldn't be papered over with sequel talk. Director Jeannot Swark inherited a script asking Helen Slater, in her very first film role, to anchor an entire franchise, while Faye Dunaway delivered a performance that could generously be described as committed. What most people don't know is what the failure set in motion. The Salkinds sold the Superman film rights entirely to Canon Films, and that single transaction is one of the stranger entries in DC's history. In the 40-odd years since the film's release, only 2 live-action DC movies have performed worse domestically, and those would be Jonah Hex and Steel, a short list nobody wants to be on. Losing control of the Superman franchise wasn't just a bad quarter, that was a legacy-ending outcome. By the time Francis Ford Coppola arrived on the Cotton Club, the production had already burned through multiple directors, multiple screenwriters, and multiple production companies, which meant millions were gone before a single frame existed. The budget had reached $58 million by December 1984 when the film finally opened, with Richard Gere and Gregory Hines headlining and a young Nicolas Cage in support. And the film genuinely delivers style in considerable quantity. What it delivered at the domestic box office was approximately $25.9 million, nominal figures, which covered less than half of what it cost to produce, and that budget number excludes marketing entirely. What makes this one sting is that Coppola brought real vision to the project, setting his story against the jazz age world of Harlem with enough craft to make the wasted potential genuinely frustrating. Orion Pictures absorbed the damage. The broader lesson that no amount of directorial ambition can compensate for a production financially compromised before cameras roll cost $58 million to learn. Some films don't fail because the idea was wrong. They fail because the money was already gone. There's something almost difficult to process about Revolution's numbers. Hugh Hudson, fresh from Chariots of Fire, directed an American War of Independence epic with a $28 million budget for Warner Brothers and Goldcrest Films, and the film earned $359,000 at the U.S. box office in 1985, nominal figures. That is not a rounding error. It is $359,000 on $28 million spent, which works out to a return ratio that remains one of the worst in 1980s cinema history. Al Pacino plays a New York fur trapper whose accent critics described as floating somewhere between Scottish, Cockney, and the Bronx, which is a remarkable achievement for a character set in colonial America. The film was pulled from U.S. cinemas within days of opening, and the fallout extended well beyond one bad production. Goldcrest Films, once the most respected production company in Britain, with credits including Gandhi and Chariots of Fire itself, never fully recovered from the combined weight of its mid-decade losses, and Revolution was the most visible wound. One film with the wrong cast, the wrong tone, and the wrong timing came close to collapsing an institution. A studio that backed Gandhi was brought to its knees by a single miscalculation. The film industry is unforgiving in ways that other industries simply are not. Santa Claus. The movie was conceived by Ilya Salkind directly in response to the failure of Supergirl, and if that origin story does not already tell you something useful, nothing will. The budget landed somewhere between $30 million and $50 million depending on which source you consult, with genuine conflict between those estimates and neither figure, including marketing, while the US box office returned $23.7 million when the film opened in November 1985, nominal figures. Dudley Moore, John Lithgow, and a large-scale production filmed at Pinewood Studios between August and November 1984 combined to produce a film that John Lithgow later described as one of the tackiest movies he had ever been in, before adding, almost apologetically, that it had become enormous in Britain and still aired every Christmas as a seasonal institution. The insider detail that somehow never gets discussed is that 10 reindeer were shot in Norway to provide skins for the film's animatronic versions, a fact that became a tabloid scandal at the time. John Carpenter was originally offered the director's chair and wanted Brian Dennehy cast as Santa Claus, which is a version of this film that exists only as an interesting hypothetical. Schwartz got the job, Carpenter moved on, and the film that emerged bombed in America while accidentally becoming a British Christmas tradition. It failed in the country that made it, and became beloved in a country that did not. The film industry remains genuinely baffling. Labyrinth is the most quietly heartbreaking entry on this entire list. Jim Henson directing, George Lucas producing, David Bowie starring opposite a teenage Jennifer Connelly, a $25 million budget, and a finished film that earned $12.9 million during its US theatrical run in 1986, nominal figures, while critics responded with something between indifference and mild disappointment. Henson's son Brian later indicated that the reception marked the beginning of a genuinely difficult period in his father's life, and given what Henson had put into the project, that context matters. What the theatrical failure couldn't predict was what happened next, because through VHS and home media, Labyrinth found an entirely different audience, one that discovered it years after the cinema doors had closed and responded to it with the kind of devotion that theatrical runs rarely generate. The film also carries a technical distinction that almost nobody mentioned at the time. The CGI owl at the opening was created by animators Larry Yeager and Bill Croyer at Digital Productions, and it stands as the first realistic computer-generated animal in cinema history. I was genuinely rooting for this one, even knowing how the numbers turned out, because the gap between what the film tried to do and what it was given credit for remains one of cinema's longer-running injustices. The box office said no in 1986. Every generation since has disagreed. Howard the Duck occupies its own category of 1980s disaster, partly because of the numbers and partly because of everything that happened around them. Universal spent between $30 million and $36 million on the production in 1986, nominal figures, and the domestic gross came in at $16.3 million, with international receipts adding $21.7 million. Still nowhere near break-even once marketing costs enter the calculation. Director Willard Hook and executive producer George Lucas delivered what was technically the first theatrical Marvel Comics film since a 1944 serial, which is either a fascinating piece of trivia or a warning that went unheeded, depending on your perspective. You would think the George Lucas Association alone would get audiences into seats, but here is the thing. The film was originally conceived as an animated production and became live action entirely because of a contractual obligation, and that single decision arguably determined the rest of the film's fate. Industry reports from the period suggest that Universal production executives engaged in a pointed and very public disagreement over who had actually authorized the project, and the Variety headline "Duck Cooks Price's Goose" appeared shortly before studio head Frank Price departed the company. The connection was not subtle. 4 Razzie wins followed, the cast found subsequent projects difficult to secure, and Howard the Duck settled into its reputation as one of the decade's defining catastrophes. Decades later, Howard appeared as a cameo in Guardians of the Galaxy, completing one of the stranger rehabilitations in Hollywood history. From career ender to Marvel Cinematic Universe Easter egg is quite an arc for a cartoon duck. Highlander cost $19 million to produce in 1986 and returned $5.9 million domestically, nominal figures, with a worldwide gross of $12.8 million that still left 20th Century Fox absorbing a considerable loss. What the studio had on its hands was genuinely unusual, a fantasy film spanning centuries, with a Frenchman cast as a Scottish Highlander, a Scotsman playing an Egyptian Spanish immortal, and an Australian music video director helming the whole thing, which on paper reads as a collection of contradictions rather than a coherent production strategy. By every conventional measure, Highlander should have disappeared quietly and permanently. Instead, it gathered one of the most committed cult followings of the entire decade, fueled almost entirely by home video, and eventually produced a television series that ran for 6 seasons and kept the mythology alive well into the 1990s. The box office result and the cultural result exist in entirely separate universes in this case, and the distance between them is one of the more interesting arguments for why theatrical performance is an incomplete measure of a film's actual reach. Fox lost money. The mythology refused to go anywhere. Tai-Pan arrived in November 1986, carrying an adaptation of James Clavell's best-selling novel and a budget of approximately $25 million, a figure cited consistently across sources, though the original documentation is older than 2 years and should be treated accordingly. De Laurentiis Entertainment Group backed the production, which filmed partly on location in China, including Guangzhou, and Brian Brown and Joan Chen led a cast working from material that had genuine commercial potential on paper. The domestic gross landed at approximately $4.4 million, a figure drawn from aggregated sources rather than verified studio documentation. What gives Tai-Pan its place in this conversation beyond its own box office failure is the larger collapse it contributed to. It was one of several consecutive losses that helped dismantle De Laurentiis Entertainment Group, an organization that had once represented one of the most powerful independent production operations in Hollywood. Dino De Laurentiis had built that position over decades, and a sustained run of expensive underperformers systematically removed it. The film is rarely discussed today, which is perhaps the most honest verdict the industry ever delivers. When the company behind your film collapses, the film tends to disappear along with it. Roman Polanski's Pirates sits at a particular extreme even within this list. The budget ran to approximately $40 million in 1986, a figure cited consistently but traced to sources older than 2 years and carrying the same caveat as other estimates from this era. The domestic gross came in at approximately $1.6 million. Walter Matthau spent extended periods of the production on a full-scale Galleon replica that alone cost $8 million to construct, wearing a prosthetic peg leg in open water conditions, which represents a level of physical commitment that the $1.6 million return does absolutely nothing to honor. Canon Films, already operating with the financial instability that defined the company throughout its existence, absorbed the loss with the particular brand of resilience that comes from having very little left to protect. Polanski continued working. The Galleon, having cost more to build than many films cost to produce entirely, presumably still exists somewhere, which is either a comfort or an indictment depending on your relationship with sunk costs. $40 million spent, $1.6 million returned, and even within this company, that lands hard. Ishtar was shot during 1985 and 1986, which plants it firmly in this era even though it reached cinemas in May 1987, and the production history alone qualifies it for any conversation about mid-decade Hollywood excess. Columbia Pictures capped the budget at just under $28 million at the outset, and the final spend came in at approximately $51 million, nominal figures, driven in part by a Moroccan desert shoot that expanded well beyond its planned timeline. The domestic box office returned $14 million, and the critical reception was hostile enough to turn the film's title into shorthand for everything the industry believed had gone wrong with big-budget production in the 1980s. Director Elaine May, working with Warren Beatty and Dustin Hoffman, became the focal point of a narrative about waste and mismanagement that followed all three of them for years. Here is what the conventional story consistently leaves out. Martin Scorsese, Quentin Tarantino, and Edgar Wright have each cited Ishtar as among their favorite films, and that group of viewers is not exactly known for poor taste in cinema. The movie the industry used as its cautionary tale is genuinely admired by some of the most precise technical minds working in the medium, and I find that gap between institutional verdict and practitioner opinion genuinely interesting, not as a defense of the production disaster, but as evidence that box office figures and artistic value are measuring entirely different things. The industry called it a disaster. Certain filmmakers quietly disagreed, and they are not wrong. Across all 10 films, the pattern that emerges goes beyond individual bad decisions or mismanaged productions. The mid-1980s represented a period when studios genuinely believed that scale could substitute for judgment, that a large enough budget combined with a recognizable name on the poster could overcome any structural problem in a project. What the decade proved, expensively and repeatedly, was that audiences cannot be spent into cinemas. The films that survived this era in cultural memory, Labyrinth, Highlander, Howard the Duck, in his own strange way, did so not because of their theatrical runs, but because home video gave them a second audience that their box office performance never earned them. The medium that rescued these films was also the medium making theatrical returns harder to guarantee, which is either ironic or simply the way the industry has always worked. The real damage these disasters caused wasn't absorbed solely by the studios that posted the losses. The deeper consequence was what happened to the mid-budget original idea, which executives increasingly stopped greenlighting in favor of sequels and adaptations they could justify on paper with comparative data. The spending failures of 1984 to 1986 didn't just burn money, they changed the calculation for what Hollywood decided was worth attempting, and the shape of that shift is still visible in what gets made today. Films that fail spectacularly leave a longer mark than films that succeed quietly. That's not justice, it's just how the industry keeps score. The pattern of films that became cultural touchstones despite catastrophic releases is the territory this channel covers, and there's considerably more of it to work through.